everyone, Christina here with Sheridan Art and Designs, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit how you can quickly modify a sleeve in your pattern. Now, sleeves can be kind of tricky. A lot of people have problems, including me sometimes, setting them in to that hole that you create in your pattern. It's called the arm side. So I want to keep my quick modifications quick, and the best way to do that is by leaving that arm side alone. So that can be tricky when you want to change the shape of the sleeve, right? So I'm going to show you a few ways of how I've done some sleeve modifications in the past with one-piece sleeves and two-piece sleeves. And I'll walk you through why you want to leave that arm side alone and how you can really change the shape of a sleeve without changing that particular piece of the pattern. Now, if you don't know what an arm side is, it is this piece right here that when you sew your front to your back, or with your side, if you have side panels, it creates the hole that your arm goes through, right? So that is where your sleeve attaches to your shirt. And the reason you want to try and leave that alone is because if you change the shape of that, you have to change a lot of different pattern pieces to make it all fit again, right? So part of that arm side is created by the front piece, part of it's created by the back piece, and if you have a side piece, part of it's created by the side piece. And then the sleeve piece fits into that hole. So if you change the shape of that hole on any of those pieces, you have to then go change all the other pieces to make sure that it still matches correctly. And that's a lot of work for a quick modification, right? So what I do is I try and leave the arm side alone. That way I don't have to chase down 4 different pattern pieces and change 4 different pattern pieces. I can just change the sleeve piece. Now what that means when I'm modifying is that I try to leave the first few inches of that sleeve the same. So this here, if you can see on my sweatshirt, it goes in, and then I just try and leave like 2-3 inches into the sleeve where you're not changing anything. So you know that that sleeve is going to go into that garment exactly as the manufacturer intended, right? So you know that that front, that back, side, whatever, the sleeve fits right into that hole, and you don't have to monkey around with trying to change all of those curves to make the right size hole again, right? So with that in mind, I'm going to show you I'll actually show you the modified pattern piece that I used for this. You can see exactly where I changed from pattern to me monkeying with it, right? So I knew on this pattern that it came with, it had a pretty straight sleeve, right? There was no bell to it, there was no drama to it. And Cruella needs a dramatic sleeve, right? So I knew I needed this big opening of a sleeve. So you can see, I'll show you, here's the pattern piece. And you can see this was the original piece all the way up to this notch here. So I left a few inches of the original piece so that I knew when I went to go, you know, make this piece of paper a circle. When I went to go make a circle, I knew that this piece of the sleeve would fit into those front, back, and side, arm side pieces, right? So I knew already that it would fit. But then after these first few inches, the rest of this isn't actually attached to anything else on the garment, right? Nothing about the rest of the sleeve needs to fit into anything, right? So I can change from here down all I want, and it won't affect how the garment goes together. That's where the quick modification comes in, right? So we're leaving this the same. You don't have to modify anything else. You can change anything else you want about that sleeve, right? So you can see I made a big old sleeve on the bottom part of this pattern after I knew, okay, it's gonna fit in right. Now, you might ask, how did I know that that's how big I needed the sleeve to be, right? And the fastest way I found to do it is to take your tape measure and pull out a bunch, because I knew I was gonna need a lot for this, and just make a hole, you know, make a loop, and you can adjust it, you can play with it, right? Put that on your arm and go, is that big enough? Is that dramatic enough? If it's too dramatic, make the hole smaller, right? Is that big enough? Or if you have a big sleeve and you want to make it smaller, same thing applies, right? So, oh, I want it to fit close to my wrist. You're gonna have to find out the circumference of your wrist. How can you put that on? But then you're gonna wanna take a few more measurements up your arm so that you can taper that accordingly. I was doing the opposite. I was taking it from tapered to bigger, so I didn't really have to worry about the rest of the sleeve because I knew if it was huge here, it was gonna fit the rest of my arm. But if you're taking something bigger and making it smaller, you're gonna wanna make sure that you bring it in all the way down, right? Don't just use the circumference of your wrist for your whole arm or else you'll never get your arm into it. All right, so that's the fastest way to do that, is just make a like pretend sleeve loop with your tape measure and see what size works best for you. I found that a whole yard, 36 inches, was the right circumference for this sleeve. And so that's all I did. I used the same method we've used before in these videos. I laid the original pattern piece down. I took my trusty tissue paper, tracing paper, I laid it over the top and I traced the top part. So from the original pattern piece, right, I traced this top and then I traced down the sides a few inches. It just happened that the markings on this pattern had a notch right here, so I went to there so I didn't lose my notch and I could still match the sleeve for that seam. So I just took those first few inches so I know it would go together and into the garment correctly, and then I just took off running with my big old sleeve, right? So this is a one-piece sleeve. It means it's like your normal sweatshirt, right? It just has that one seam down the sleeve, so this whole thing is one piece. And sometimes, and that's really the fastest way, but sometimes sleeves are two pieces. There's like a top sleeve and then there's a whole section on the bottom and it has two seams on a sleeve. So that's the case with this next pattern that I modified. You can see here's the original pattern pieces. There's a top sleeve and a bottom sleeve, right? Or they call it sometimes sleeve front, sleeve back. Sometimes they go this way, sometimes they go top bottom. It just depends on your pattern. But what I made sure of before I modified this two-piece pattern is I looked at how they fit together. So it happens on this pattern that they gave me two equal pieces, right? So half of a sleeve, essentially. And so I knew that when I modified them, I would have to do the exact same modification on both pieces. Sometimes you'll get just a smaller piece for your undersleeve, and so you'll have to just play around a little bit when you change your top sleeve, how much you want to widen or shorten that inner piece, right? So if they're not the same, you'll just have to play around with how they go together, but you should be able, for the most part, to change your upper sleeve and then fit that smaller piece in. However, for this one, they gave me two almost identical pieces, so I made sure that I made identical changes to both. That way I knew the sleeve would still go together. Again, I didn't change on either piece this curve because that's that shoulder curve and I want it to fit into the garment correctly. So I didn't change any of this that goes in. All of this down here, I could definitely change. Now this sleeve was a 3/4 sleeve, so I knew I had to extend it and I knew I still wanted a bigger sleeve because we're all about drama and big sleeves apparently lately. But I knew I wanted to come down to about my elbow and then I wanted a big flare, right? So I had to keep it fitted to my elbow. So what I did was I pinned these original pieces together. I put it on my arm, and you can have a friend help you with this. It's kind of hard to do on yourself, but you put it on your arm to where your shoulder seam is gonna go, right? And then you kind of look at, okay, it comes to here, I need X number of inches to get it to my wrist if you're adding, and the same goes if you're shortening, right? Oh, it comes to here, I want to shorten it to a 3/4 sleeve. You would subtract that many inches, but I was adding, so I added, you know, I think I added 6 inches or so down to get it down to a full-length sleeve, and then I checked the pattern to see, is my arm fitting into this the way I wanted to? Do I have to take it in? Now, I will caution, on the pattern is not the only time you can do fit, right? So if you're getting your arm and it's pretty close, go ahead and cut it and construct it that way, and then you can just take that seam in a little bit on the actual piece if you feel like you want it tighter, but it's hard to add, so if you have a little bit of extra on your pattern, that's probably okay, and you can just take it in a little bit when you construct it. So I was okay with how it was fitting down to my elbow. I marked that on the pattern, where's my elbow, so I knew where to cut outward to make my big bell sleeve, right? So instead of just taking those first few inches, like on the first pattern piece I showed you, I left it pretty much the same down to my elbow. And you can see, here's the new pieces, right? So I made two same pieces, a front and a back, so that they are the same. I left the markings, that's important to note, so you can see the difference of the markings on the front. So this is the sleeve back, this is the sleeve front, and you can see on this arm side curve, there's a double notch versus a single notch, and that will be important when you're fitting your sleeve into the arm side, as to determine a left and a right and how those match into the arm side. So when you modify, make sure, even though they look exactly the same, they have different markings, and you want to translate those onto the new pieces, right? So double curve, single curve, now I know this is my back and this is my front, right? So I left these pretty much untouched. You can see this is my front and this is my front. You can see I left them pretty much the same until I got to where my elbow was. So that was about here for me. And then I flared it. Same concept as the last one, right? I took my tape measure, I decided what's that circumference look like for me on this project, and I made it that line, that circumference. So you're gonna take that circumference you made excuse me, tape measures down here. You're gonna take that circumference you made on your tape measure like that, and then you're just gonna unfold, lay it out, and that should be the length of the base of your sleeve, right? The bottom of your sleeve, because that's gonna end up here at your wrist. So if you want it to be big, you wanna have that circumference down at the bottom. And that's really the modifications I made for these sleeves. It's fast and easy to make sleeve modifications if you leave that arm side alone. So as this is a video of quick modifications, honestly, if you leave this section of your sleeve alone, almost anything down here is fair play, and it won't change your, how your garment goes together. In a later video, we may show you how to change that arm side. It does involve a lot more work, and I honestly prefer not to do it if I can avoid it, just because it's a lot more trial and error of like making sure that you now have those pieces back to where they already are. So unless you really need to change that piece, I would leave it the same and just change the lower part of your sleeve, and you'll get a lot of change and a lot of difference in your finished product without having to hassle with 4 different pattern piece changes, right? You're only going to change 1, maybe 2 pattern pieces. All right, guys, that's how I do quick sleeve modifications. I hope this helped, and I'll see you in the next one.